This is Florian Hoffmann speaking from the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. I'm a German national, but I have been teaching in Brazil for a number of years. In between, I returned to Europe to do PhDs, to teach, amongst others, at the London School of Economics, and also directing a small public policy school, the Willy Brandt School of Public Policy at the University of Erfurt in Germany. And then in 2015, we opted to return to Brazil. And I would like to briefly, in line with what my predecessors in this series have already talked about, briefly reflect a little bit on the current political developments in Brazil, in Latin America, from a slightly more comparative perspective. Because, of course, what we are seeing, I'm not incidentally a Brazilianist, at least not a card-carrying Brazilianist. I am an international lawyer specializing in international human rights law, social rights, international legal theory. And in that capacity, of course, I work, amongst others, with fundamental rights. I work with comparative perspectives on both constitutionalism and human rights, and I approach the situation in Brazil currently from that angle. What, of course, is happening is we are just about to see the not entirely confirmed but likely election of Jair Bolsonaro, who is a ultra right-wing politician, rhetorically certainly within the realm of neo-fascist discourse. Of course, this doesn't necessarily mean that his government will also have these characteristics, but this is, of course, the situation that we're now facing, where Brazil, as of its redemocratization with the democratic constitution in 1988, and a number of democratic elected governments, the first two broadly centrist, center-right, and then, of course, the long period from 2002 to 2016, characterized by moderate social democracy, Lula and then Dilma as presidents. And that period seems now have come to a close. And of course, to many external observers, it's surprising how a country that as little ago as maybe a year or two ago, certainly 2 years ago, seemed to be very much aspiring to fulfill its own democratic, its economic, its political promise, in a sense, that was had undergone a significant growth period, that seemed to have had reasonably consolidated democratic and judicial institutions, that seemed to have undergone a process of modernization, which is, of course, a very complicated term that needs to be problematized, put very much into brackets, but that certainly can be in terms of a working hypothesis, narrowed down to the idea that many Brazilians within this period in the 2000s and up to more or less now, up to about 2 years ago, seem to be looking out towards the world, seem to be connecting what is specifically Brazilian with, the global conjunctures that we were experiencing. And all of that quite suddenly seems to have come to a close. Of course, this is not a unitary process. There are significant similarities to other places. Brazil, in my view, always has been and probably will continue to be a laboratory of modernity, in the sense that many of the processes we observe here happen more quickly, happen more intensely, perhaps more dramatically, but they are not fundamentally different from what we're seeing elsewhere. The end of this, in a sense, liberal, in some places more, in some places less, social democratic post-war consensus, of course, has been foreshadowed in other places. We've seen the, to many at least, unexpected election of Donald Trump in the United States after a prolonged period, in a sense, of more moderate and governments. We've seen, of course, the rise of right-wing populist, both movements and then increasingly also governments in Europe, not least and most recently perhaps Italy, but of course also Eastern European countries like Hungary or Poland have been in these types of governing situations. And now suddenly Brazil. And of course, what connects Brazil to many of these previous phenomena is first the suddenness in which a seemingly stable, seemingly ordinarily functioning political system suddenly, in a sense, implodes. Implodes much faster than those who would like to defend it can, in fact, accompany, understand, and counteract. So in a sense, there is really a feeling of being steamrolled, in a sense, by what one could arguably call a propaganda blitzkrieg, in a sense, whereby these new populist forces use the democratic process, use techniques that often previously were in fact pioneered by movements associated broadly to the left, in terms of forging a particular vision, forging a particular discourse, and through these tactics manage to conquer significant amounts of the electorate, significant parts of the electorate in order to come in. So the question is, of course, what will happen to Brazil after this potential election of this particular candidate? So what will happen to Brazil in the world with and in a potential Bolsonaro administration? Of course, again, we can look at other places where this has happened, for example, the Philippines, for example, Hungary, where indeed fundamental rights have not necessarily been suspended in their entirety, but where certainly international treaty obligations have been phased down, have been relativized, have been violated, in a sense, where participation in multilateral mechanisms in the UN procedures, not just those related to human rights, but all UN multilateral procedures have been at least rhetorically questioned, in some instances also fundamentally undermined. So unfortunately, there is no longer no precedent for this. The primary precedent, one has to say, in terms of at least rhetoric, certainly has been the United States under the Trump administration, which has, of course, made a point of defining its international action according to its particular national interests, and therefore has entirely made its participation in UN mechanisms, for example, contingent on those interests. That's not a position invented by the Trump government, but of course the Trump government has pursued this in a particularly new and provocative way. And of course, by all indications, and at least by the rhetoric, a potential Bolsonaro government is also going to pursue a selective approach to multilateralism. We will likely see a phasing down of regionalism in terms of participation in Mercosur, participation in other regional settings, and we will potentially, at least rhetorically, see a downgrading of general multilateralism in form of the UN and its mechanisms. We will most certainly, and we unfortunately have already seen this even now in this 2 years transition process, so to speak, a significant at least non-attention to international obligations, especially international human rights obligations, with the judiciary, as I said, in part at least being unwilling to police and supervise Brazil's international obligations, and the executive, of course, being, at least for the last 2 years, more or less, also increasingly unwilling to actually heed international obligations. We know that the inter-American system, for example, is facing a grave financial crisis, inter-American human rights system, that is. Under a new Brazilian government, it's unlikely that Brazil will step in to salvage the system or to prop it up, in a sense. So we might see a further degradation, in a sense, of the logistical institutional capacities of that system. So clearly, I think Brazil, as big an actor in the world, and of course many Brazilians, I think, are not aware how big and important an actor in the world Brazil is. Many, as an actor in the world, Brazil's, in a sense, falling into a Trumpian foreign policy line will have, I think, an impact both on Brazil's compliance with international obligations, but also on the salience of multilateralism and of an international rule of law all over the place, because, of course, again, Brazil is too big to simply not be noticed if it starts not playing along. And, of course, it was, since the Constitution, and especially in the Constitution itself, always there was a strong commitment for that kind of participation, for international human rights, for treaty obligations, etc. And so this would be definitely a break with the redemocratized recent past in Brazil. And of course, it's always problematic to use terminologies that were created for much earlier historical period. There is a grave danger of anachronism. So, for example, to call Bolsonaro fascist or even neo-fascist, of course, puts him close to movements that are not necessarily Brazilian, that grew out of rather different historical circumstances. And of course, what will happen to the Brazilian state and also to Brazilian society after not just this coming Sunday, but also January, then when a potentially new government would constitute itself, is something possibly quite new. Again, its global connection points are probably places like Putin's Russia, Duterte's Philippines, or indeed Orban's Hungary. But of course, each of these places still has a few specificities, and Brazil here will have its own specificities. What we can already observe is a very close proximity between the ultra-right movement of this particular candidate and his party and his now quite strong parliamentary representation on one hand, and other actors, in particular the military on one hand and the judiciary on the other hand. So we have a strong currently connivance, in a sense, between these three types of actors, who, in my view, do not actually have coincidental interests, certainly not long-term interests, but who, in terms of the particular conjuncture we're seeing, are interacting so as to constitute probably a regime that will nominally be led by a democratically, with a wide margin, democratically elected president of a populist, ultra-right-wing / potentially neo-fascist kind, certainly in rhetoric, certainly in style. But many of the governmental functions, I think, will be factually devolved either to actors associated to the military, and this quite without a formalized takeover or the cliche images of the past with mustachioed and bespectacled military, dictators or presidents watching sort of parades. But this will be a much smoother, much more professional looking and much more subtle, in a sense, form of governance. And then on the side, of course, there will be, at least as far as we're seeing now, there will not even be a fundamental need to suspend the rule of law, because even now, and the run-up in a sense has been the last 2 years, a certain part, not all, but a certain part of the judiciary have simply accompanied the undermining of fundamental rights, the undermining of judicial due process, of certain basic principles of criminal process, for instance, and have, of course, thereby not only helped along the particular political actors that we're seeing right now emerge, but will, in my view, also continue to do this. There will, of course, be resisting forces. None of these three elements, in a sense, are entirely homogeneous. There will be fallouts, I think, in the process of this government, both constituting itself and then starting to operate. Its program is, of course, as all populist right-wing programs, deeply inconsistent, and has no final utopia, in my view, at least not a utopia that it could potentially sell to anyone. So obviously, these contradictions will end up showing. And so there might be not only a particular linearity to what will unfold in Brazil, but there might also be many unexpecteds and many unknown knowns, in a sense, and unknown unknowns, so to speak. But of course, it remains deeply surprising and deeply concerning how fast fundamental respect, even nominal fundamental respect for democratic institutions and for fundamental rights has eroded in this country. Even at the beginning of the year, when the election campaign was already beginning to take a certain dynamics, and when the different candidates, and this particular candidate too, were already in the bidding, it wasn't really foreseen that we would see a two-horse race that would be slated, in a sense, in this extremely strong and asymmetric way, where there's really a wave of popular support that is going to be very hard to break within this remaining week of the campaign. So Brazil is once again at the forefront, so to speak, of global developments. Of course, in this case of a global, that particular global development, which is, of course, quite very concerning for everyone committed to democracy, committed to fundamental rights, committed to a proper rule of law. But at the same time, of course, Brazil has in the past also shown very significant resilience. I, for one, have always argued that Brazil is never going to have a fascism, in quotes, or fascist regime in the sense of the European past, for instance. Rhetorically, that statement now seems a bit off, because that seems to be precisely what we're heading for. But I still think that Brazil is too big and too diverse to actually make the kind of unified, unitary form of governance that we have seen in the European past, at least, possible. So I think these will be interesting times, difficult times, but certainly interesting times to accompany from a Latin Americanist, from a Brazilianist, from a generally global interested person perspective. Thank you.